Hi, and welcome to Smart Training 365. This is Mo, and I'm with John Gaglione to give you some updates about the seminar in New York. So, John, welcome again. So we got a few people who booked originally for the Friday, and the first thing that we want you to know is that we moved it to Saturday, which is instead of the 12th, it will be the 13th, right? And the time will be, what time did we say?
I think we said 10.
Yeah, 10. So what we will be talking about is the Brick 20 exercises, and we will be talking also about the powerlifting move, the big three. You know, how if that's something that you want to pursue. John Gaglione will actually go in details about like how to start. So John, like how do you usually guide someone who never did the big three in the beginning? Also familiar with Brick 20, like how you think they fit in a program like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm really excited for the event. And I think that if you're kind of on the fence, I would just say like pull the trigger. I'm sure Mo will put links in the description. So definitely check, even while you're listening to this, if you want to, book your spot. Yeah. So in terms of starting the big three, and then for those that are not familiar, the sport of powerlifting is comprised of the squat, the bench press, and the deadlift with a straight bar. There's a lot of nuances to which federation you're doing, but essentially most of the rules and most of the federations will have a similar interpretation of the rules, where you're utilizing a straight bar with the barbell on your back, and you're squatting to a point where the hip crease is below your knee. So we kind of call that like below parallel. Everyone's interpretation of what squat depth is very different. So I kind of talk about how squat depth is kind of like a strike zone for an umpire. So you have to kind of match the standard of the federation you're lifting in.
Mm-hmm.
That's a sport specific thing. So like, whereas someone who's just maybe squatting for general fitness, you can make a case for what full range of motion is in terms of powerlifting. Powerlifting depth is classified as the hip crease below the knee. In the bench press, you're going to start at arm's length, bring it down to where it touches your chest. You're going to bring the bar motionless and then press it back up, and your butt needs to stay in contact with the bench. And then in case of the deadlift, it's going to be, 45-pound plates. Some federations might use kilogram plates or 100-pound plates. So that's going to be a full range of motion deadlift where you need to stand up fully erect with the hips and the knees fully locked out. And then you could use a belt. You could use wrist straps, and depending on if you're lifting raw or equipped, that you could sometimes use knee wraps or squat suits and other like supportive gear, but it's not required. You could just lift with nothing if you could go completely raw. So when someone's starting out, like, again, I treat powerlifting is a sport, it's a competition. So the first thing is kind of developing the skill and developing the movement pattern. And I like to think of it like there's kind of style, there's technique,
Mm-hmm.
and there's your form. So like some people might have a specific way. I kind of like to use the analogy of like a basketball player shooting a free throw. They might have a specific kind of ritual or routine of like how to dribble the ball. And that's kind of where your style comes into play. So that's going to be very individual. The technique, there are some fundamental things like I talked about before, like your squat depth and stuff. Like the barbell should stay over your midfoot when you squat and deadlift, for example. There are some fundamental technical things you need to work on. How you breathe, how you brace, how you kind of stabilize your torso. We talk about a lot about, since the squat and the deadlift, they have some compromises. So how can we minimize those compromises by utilizing, intra-abdominal pressure and bracing, so we can kind of lock the spine in place, because the spine is not a fixed, segment. You have all these like, facet joints that need to be stabilized when you squat and when you deadlift, when you start to tip over. And, your form can be varied. So some people lift squat wide, some people squat narrow, some people squat with a low bar position, some people squat with a higher bar position, some people use a close grip or a wide grip, a big arch, a moderate arch. Some people lift with a sumo stance, the deadlift. Some people use a conventional deadlift. Some people intentionally round their upper back a little bit when they deadlift. So that's where kind of a style comes, and your form can vary lifter to lifter, depending on your leverages and depending on what muscles are strong and what muscles are weak. So obviously, like if you're like in a higher bar squat and you're your lower leg is more tipped forward, you're going to be utilizing more legs and quadriceps. If you're more in a low bar squat, you're more tipped over more, it's going to be a little bit more glute dominant. And
Erectus spinae.
You're going to be using your low back and stuff to squat the weight a little bit more. So kind of depending on a lot of those factors, it's important to kind of understand what muscles are going to be a little bit more like under load. Yep. And that can also dictate where you should spend your time in terms of like what muscles are going to be contributing to the lift a little bit more. Mm-hmm. And also kind of where you potentially fail in a lift. But kind of going back to your original question, I got excited about this stuff and I think about it all the time. But you want to start off with like a very light weight. And I also will sometimes use drills to teach the movement. So there might be some exercises, for example, like starting off with actually a front loaded squat is a great way to teach a lifter to kind of keep their torso more rigid and upright, because that implement is going to naturally want to pull you forward and kind of forces you into a more upright style squat. So starting off with someone like a goblet squat, for example, with a dumbbell could be a good way to introduce them to just the movement of squatting, and obviously body weight squats and things like that. So starting off with certain movements that kind of, they will teach better technique. In terms of the bench press, sometimes we might start someone off even with a partial range of motion, or even do like a floor press where their legs are not involved. So it's a less complicated form of the lift. And then we can start to incorporate the legs. And in the case of a deadlift, we might start off with a Romanian deadlift, which is essentially like a semi-straight legged deadlift. Like we're teaching the hip hinge. So if someone could hip hinge, it's a less complicated form of the deadlift. There's less moving parts. We're just kind of teaching the athlete to hinge with a neutral spine position and with a rigid torso position. And it's a great way to kind of understand what the lockout position of the deadlift will be. And then we can start to incorporate a full range of motion. So those are just some quick examples of kind of starting points. Mm-hmm. And someone who's more advanced may be able to kind of jump into the full barbell lifts right away, but it's not necessary. So if you look at any sport like football, for example, or soccer, the first thing you're going to learn is like an athletic stance. You're going to first learn like the setup. So learning the setup is going to be really important, because a better start is going to yield a better finish. And then we can start to kind of get to more complicated things like, okay, well, once you're in a good position, now we can actually start to execute some of the movements you're going to see like in football, like on the field, how you're going to, and then kind of go from there. So there's kind of a starting point, and there's progressions to everything you do.
Yeah.
And then once you kind of get the movements down, then you could start to, employ special exercises or auxiliary movements. And the Brig 20 could certainly kind of fall into those categories. So you want to kind of figure out, okay, well, what muscles are contributing to these sports specific movements, and then get those muscles stronger. That's going to kind of aid in the performance and carry over to your competition lifts.
Yeah.
So I'll kind of leave it like that, because I can keep going, but that's kind
of that's a great overview. That's a great overview, because I know that it can get very complicated. Sometimes people are overwhelmed with everything they see online. So they will try something that in their opinion, it's something that they can do, but it falls in like a more advanced program instead of like a beginner or intermediate. So this is to kind of bring like a more clarity to what exercises they should start using, and just to clarify, because some people said when they watched our first video that, we thought that you only talk about the Brig 20 and you're against powerlifting, But I want to say that what we're doing here is we're not really saying that you should do the powerlifting to build muscle. This is a discipline on itself. Like, so if you're playing a football or soccer or, powerlifting, it's a skill that you need to learn that requires like a certain technique, repetition, and all sports come with risk and benefit, so you need to know that. And we're telling you this, and we're doing this seminar with John because he's really experienced. He's been doing this for a few years with the best athletes. He achieved like great results. So combining the Brig 20 and the power lift will really benefit those who are interested in learning powerlifting. But don't confuse the two goals. If your goal is muscle building, then the Brick 20 are a great way to do that. You can achieve also muscle building with compound movement, but each one has its cost and benefit, from injury point of view, from time point of view. So it doesn't mean that you cannot achieve, what Arnold or, all the big bodybuilders achieved. But what we're saying is you can still load the muscle differently. One mistake that I see all the time in the gym, John, is like, when you see people deadlifting or, doing the big three, they say that there is like a hormonal response and that will contribute to muscle growth. You as a power lifter who've been doing this for a long time, do you recommend someone like if he wants to build muscle to do the big lifts instead of like focusing on what the muscle does best?
Yeah, I would say a lot of depend is going to be, like you mentioned before, it's going to dictate on like what their goal is. If their goal is exclusively muscle building, there is no compound lift that is necessary for that. I have found with myself that just from competing in powerlifting for over 15 years, that you can kind of tell, like kind of based on how I'm built.
Yes.
Based on like the thickness of like my back and stuff, my body has had to adapt to loading 700-800 pounds. And when I was bigger, 900 and even a handful of times 1,000 pounds on my back. And your body needs to adapt to that. In a lot of the deadlifting over the years, the handful of times I pulled 700 in training. There's a certain type of thickness that your body. So even like if you think about like a 700-pound deadlift, even though I'm kind of holding my back in an isometric position and my traps in an isometric position, it's still such a massive, load, even if it's not like necessarily optimal.
Mm-hmm.
You will get like some, but again, I got a similar response from, doing shrugs with 100-pound dumbbells and, and going through a full range of, or a more full range of motion. Mm-hmm. So I think if the goal is exclusively muscle building, then utilizing more isolation exercises. So you could like throw grenades, which I would say compound movements is kind of like throwing grenades. You're going to get, some effects with that. But if you really want to like isolate your quad, being more of a sniper, if you want to grow your quadriceps, then like doing something like a sissy squat or leg extension is going to make more sense because it's more targeted, it's more focused. I have always found that even with myself, like when I was a lot younger, I would tend to get very bent over with my squats. I would tend to get very bent over with my deadlifts and not be able to hold my position because my lower body was always stronger. My lower back was always stronger than my upper body. I didn't have like the back strength and the upper body strength to kind of stabilize my torso. So like the more I did those movements, the more I kind of ingrained that kind of poor motor pattern. I always kind of shifted to my stronger muscle groups. So if like my glutes were not strong enough to kind of do the lift, my lower back would like take over. You kind of get in this like hamster wheel where you're trying to fix it. But unless you address like the surrounding muscle groups, like you're always going to kind of revert back to what's stronger and you're going to kind of re-ingrain a poor motor pattern. So, but again, going back to what you were saying about, so I think the compound movements like are really good at like, I think what people kind of, when they say this hormonal response and things like that, I think that people like it's kind of like it causes like a fight or flight kind of response, which, may or may not be good, but I think it's just, we're feeling that stress. And sometimes we kind of associate that soreness, that fatigue with growth, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's happening. So there is definitely, we were talking a little bit off air about, we're talking about Renaissance periodization. A lot of terms, they use the term like stimulus to fatigue ratio. So like a barbell squat is going to have a very high, you're going to get a lot of fatigue. You're going to get a lot of stimulus to the body, but it's also going to cause a lot of fatigue. Whereas something like a leg extension, you're going to get a lot of stimulus to the quadricep, but not a lot of fatigue. So I think that if you're trying to incorporate a lot of volume, because that's going to be a big driver of muscle growth, if you could pick exercises that are less fatiguing, but with a high stimulus, then that's like a win-win. So that's kind of like how I would look at it.
Yeah.
So what are the exercises that you could do more frequently? Because that's going to allow you to achieve more total training volume. And that's going to ultimately lead to, again, my understanding, I'm not like an expert in like the research stuff, but to my understanding, like that volume is a big driver of growth, which is why like, you know, again, like you see a lot of like Arnold and a lot of these bodybuilders, like they do like a ton of sets. It's not just like, and not to say like, can you do like one set to failure and things like that? I think it's been kind of like shown to my understanding that if you could do multiple sets, leave a little bit in the tank, and then maybe towards your last set, you can go closer to failure.
Yeah.
You're gonna achieve more training volume. So if you pick exercises that are less fatiguing, you could typically achieve more training volume that way. So that's kind of like how I would look at it.
Absolutely. No.
Okay. So
that's a great explanation, and I agree with you on that. You know, that's why like it's important for people to understand the difference between the goals, you know, because if you have two goals, sometimes they can like contradict each other, you know, so you need to understand what is required to achieve this goal, what kind of exercises, what type of weight, sets, and all that, and frequency. And if your goal is, for example, muscle growth, what type of exercises you need to do, you know, weight and frequency and all that. So it's totally different. You heard it from someone who's been in the game for a long time, and he's telling you like you got to understand your goals. So I will add the link to our seminar in the video description. You know, if you have any question regarding the seminar and future seminars in different places, don't hesitate to ask them in the comment section. John, before we wrap it up, do you have anything you want to say?
Yeah, I think kind of just going back to what you said, just kind of understanding your goal is really important. And I think it's fine, even if you maybe you don't have aspirations of competing in powerlifting, but I think it's fine to like have a goal. I think it's of like, I want to like bench press 315 or whatever. And I think that's fine. But what we're going to try and teach you is like, what's going to be the most safest and efficient way to do it. Because it's great that like, because you don't want to be just chasing numbers at the sake of like injuring yourself. And I've been there. So right now, since incorporating the Brig 20 into the routine and reducing my overall training volume on some of the big lifts, I'm starting to see like some of my best improvements. I'm on pace for, you know, hopefully one of my best meets, if not my best meet ever. So I think that's a big deal for someone that's been lifting at a fairly high level for over 15 years. So we're really excited. This is kind of new information. We're figuring out how to apply it with We Go. So we invite you to come down to Strong Island, New York, and we can't wait to have you.
All right, thank you very much. We will keep you updated with our next videos in the video description as well. We will be doing that response video that everyone is asking about. It's just like we've been very busy lately. I don't know if I told you that. We're doing a documentary. We're working on different projects. So time is really difficult to find to do a few things, but it's going to happen. So thank you very much for watching us, and I'll see you in the next video.